Welcome on in to the Utah Blockcast. I'm Steve Bartle, Utah Insider for KSL Sports. Before we get into the show, just want to say thank you to all the support, all the blockheads out there for supporting the podcast. I want to admit, I know it's not the most organized or the most well thought out a lot of times, and that's entirely on me, but I do appreciate you all for continuing to show support to the podcast. I know I need to be better, and we'll focus on being more organized and involved with you guys. I'll be real with you guys. I love doing this. It's fantastic. I have a dream job in many regards, and I realize at the same time it's pretty hard. It's a difficult job. It's tough to put yourself out there, sometimes, but I know I need to do that more as well. So hoping, to be a stronger presence for Utah fans, particularly on social media and that sort of stuff, just being a more consistent voice and adding my opinions on social media and that sort of stuff. So, hoping to do some things moving forward. With this, going to switch it up a little bit. This has been a football only podcast over the last, 5 years. The years that we've done it, at least. but with the move to KSL Sports, I've said this before, but there's a need to evolve. And so, I've forgotten what that means at points this season. I need to be better at again, being organized and being bringing more just general news and that sort of stuff. And that's going to be a point of focus for me as well moving forward. But, with this, we're going to start talking some basketball, and that's going to be an important topic, both men's and women's basketball. And so on this episode, I welcome Evan Miyakawa, owner of evanmiya.com, which is a fantastic college basketball analytics site. Welcome him on for about 30 minutes to discuss the Big 12 Conference and Runnin Utes basketball. So excited for that. And before we get to all that, I've got just some news and notes to share before we open up that basketball discussion. If you missed the last episode, I had Stevenson Sylvester, the Utah man. Man, he is, when you think of a Utah man, it's Sly. Sly joined me to talk about Utah's 2024 season, and Sly didn't hold back. I think he shared a lot of genuine thoughts and also shared a lot of frustrations that, fans have felt. And I think we all sort of recognize with the program this season. So if you missed that, go back and give it a listen. I do plan on doing more episodes like that with Sly and with others moving forward. So excited about that. And then as we get into basketball season, I'm hoping to incorporate some men and women's basketball players throughout the season. And I'll also welcome Andrew Crowley on the podcast from time to time. And I'm sure I'll be on his podcast as well. Andrew's done such a fantastic job with the Runnin Hoops podcast. If you aren't subscribed to that, go do that right now. Again, he's done a fantastic job over the last couple of years of really turning that into arguably the go-to podcast for, Pac-12 Utah basketball, college basketball discussion, and he's going to continue to lead the way in that regard moving forward as well into the Big 12. So excited about that. And as I said, we'll have basketball players, both men's and women's basketball, hoping to potentially have, a reoccurring guest every so often from the women's team, working on some things there. Have expressed some desire to have somebody on the podcast, and so we'll see if we can finalize that moving forward, but definitely want to incorporate that moving forward as well. I know Cam Beck is probably rolling his eyes at me wanting to talk about a sport that doesn't exist, but it's what we got to do. It's what we got to do. And I'm excited about it, honestly. With the move to the Big 12, it's a big deal. This is the best conference in college basketball, in my opinion. And, it's going to be tough, obviously, this year for Utah, but it's going to be exciting as well. And so just to sort of set the stage before, getting into my, discussion with Evan Miyakawa, let's sort of set the stage on the basketball conversation. Utah picked 16th in the preseason media poll. I was surprised to see that a little bit. I figured they'd be 13th, 14th, 15th, but to be dead last, I think I was surprised But honestly, I think it works to Utah's favor, just given the fact that there's low to no expectations for this team. And I think, that can be kind of freeing, in a lot of ways. So with that, though, the Big 12, just to sort of provide context as to how good this conference is, in the AP Top 25 that was released October 14th, there are 10 Big 12 programs that at least receive votes, with 6 of them ranked in the top 25 and 5 of them in the top 10, which includes Kansas at number 1, Houston number 4, Iowa State at number 5, Baylor 8th, Arizona 10th, and Cincinnati 20th. So, this conference is loaded with talent. The other teams receiving votes, Texas Tech, Kansas State, BYU, and Arizona State. So, this is going to be a tough conference. I like what Craig Smith was able to do, all things considered, this offseason with the turnover, with the losses, both staff-wise and, personnel-wise. I like the additions that he's brought in, and seeing the team in the exhibition the other night, you see sort of the identity that Craig Smith wants with this team. He wants to be a tough defensive team. I think the size of this team combined with the athleticism and length that this team has, I think will allow them to be, effective on the defensive end. It's all just going to come down to, how much effort these guys put in on a consistent basis, which is going to be something that Evan brings up in this discussion. And then, it's going to be important for a couple guys to take steps in their games. And, when you're talking about that, a guy like Miro Little, Ezra Sarr, Mike Sharavjumps, those guys in particular are going to be key to that. So, just wanted to set the stage there. So with all of that said, let's get to my 30-minute discussion with Evan Miyakawa. Joining me today to talk some college basketball, something we don't do a lot on the Blockcast or haven't done a lot of. I thought what better than to get some, somebody with, a great idea of the picture in college basketball, what this season is going to look like. Evan has been fantastic over the last few years in building his reputation in the game, and he's done a fantastic job. So Evan, welcome to the show. Appreciate you joining me today.
Absolutely. Glad to be here. Glad to hype up the college hoops season. I know it doesn't carry quite as much cachet as football, but I think it's going to be a great one, especially for Utah in the Big 12, which is arguably the best conference in the country in basketball. So it should be fun.
Man, those are strong words. Evan, starting strong. I like it. So let's just dive into it. I think first of all, let's start with your story. Curious to hear about you. You haven't been doing this very long, but you've already kind of ascended to, a lot of national recognition, and you've done great work, and your stuff is top notch. And so just kind of give us your story, how you got into this and where you're at now.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Steve. All glory to God. It's just been a really cool journey. So yeah, my background is in stats and sports analytics, but my favorite sport my whole life has been college basketball. I grew up in Indianapolis, about 10 minutes from the Butler Bulldog campus. I went to the Butler Duke National Championship game where Gordon Hayward almost hit that infamous half-court shot. So I've always been like college basketball first. It's my favorite sport. I just love how intricate it is. And so then you kind of fast forward, and I was I got my PhD in statistics from Baylor, Big 12. And while I was in school there, I initially as a side project just started putting together some formulas, some algorithms for rating college basketball teams, and then extended that to players. Made a website out of it just initially kind of as a fun thing to kind of spread the word, get some feedback, hone my skills. And it has just sort of grown organically over the years to be this massive thing where now I left my previous job doing consulting for NBA teams to focus full-time on this college basketball website. And, the site covers, a lot of different things, and it's used by lots of coaches, people in the media like yourself, and fans for analyzing the sport. And it's just been a super fun journey.
That's awesome. I think, and you go to your site, it's filled with great detail, a lot of cool insights. I've been playing with it the last couple of days, and man, it's just fun to see these numbers and all that. And that's great. You put in the work, and it's something you're passionate about. I can relate to that, having kind of gotten my start, just essentially off Twitter, and then just kind of worked and turned this into a gig. And so, that's awesome, man. I appreciate just the effort and appreciate the climb. It's special, it's unique, and you've put in the time to be here, man. So that's cool.
Yeah, it's certainly a privilege to be able to do this as my job, and I'm just thankful to the Lord for the opportunity. I know you can relate, as in the capacity that you do, being able to coverage college athletics and that kind of be our thing. So it's a really cool opportunity for sure.
Absolutely, man. So let's dive into this. The Big 12 conference. A lot of conversation, a lot of debate about who the top conference in college basketball, where that lies. Is it the SEC? Is it the Big 12? Is it the Big 10? ACC? For the longest time, I always felt the ACC was the best. When you grow up and you watch Duke, North Carolina, and you watch those games, and here's the Big 12 that is just quietly but consistently just had contenders. Trips to the Final Four, trips to the national championship games, and here we are, 2024, Utah joining the conference. How do you see the Big 12, and where does it stack up according to you in all of college basketball?
Yeah, the crazy thing about the Big 12 is it has been rated the number one conference according to the analytics, and certainly according to my models, for the last several years. And I still think somehow the conference is underrated, which is crazy. This year, it's kind of a toss-up in the preseason between the SEC and the Big 12. But if we're talking about the conference that is going to have the highest chance of a national champion coming from that conference, it's 100% the Big 12. The Big 12, especially at the top of the conference, is absolutely loaded. And kind of in preparing for this question, I did a little bit of research here. So if you look at last year's Big 12 teams and where they're rated in the preseason this year without the new additions, the average team from last year's Big 12 composition is 23rd in the country, and there are 7 teams inside the top 20 nationally in the preseason. If we compare that to last year's Pac-12 before it dissolved, average ranking 89th in the country, and there was only one team from last year's Pac-12 in the top 20, that's Arizona. So 1 in the top 20 compared to 7 in the Big 12. A massive, massive jump for Utah, and that's what we're talking about here. This conference is absolutely insane.
That is wild. Essentially 7 Arizonas, but better. That is crazy. Wow. No wonder this conference has been as competitive and as accomplished as it's been over the last couple of years, or after the last several years. Wow. That blew me away. I was curious because, for Utah fans making that transition to the Big 12, we've seen a lot of competitive basketball. We've seen some competitive teams. Obviously, Arizona, has always been at the top of the Pac-12. Oregon has been great at times. UCLA and USC were always good. But it seems like the depth of top tier talent in this league is just so much better. And that stat to start us out just blows my mind.
Yeah, it's going to be an absolute gauntlet. I do think the bottom of the Big 12 is a bit softer than it's been in years past because of the additions of Colorado, Arizona State are kind of dragging the bottom a little bit there. But that still means for a team like Utah, you're not going to have you can't have an off night. You're not going to have, a team that's going to kind of be outside the top 150 in the country, most likely by the end of the season. So it's going to be a gauntlet for sure, and just a very different beast than what the Pac-12 was.
Yeah, what do you make of the difference in terms of style of play? Maybe what it takes to be good in this conference, because it just seems like this is a totally different level of basketball.
I think it is consistency on a night-to-night basis and defensive intensity. This conference has never been the most flashy in terms of entertaining basketball, in terms of even having the most star players, the biggest names in the sport. But the grinded out affair that you have every night in the Big 12 and what it takes to beat one of these teams once you get to March Madness in the tournament, it's just a different animal altogether. And so I think that is really what this conference is about, is consistency. And if you can't be consistent, you're just going to drop off. And then defensive intensity. This conference has been far and away the best defensive conference the last several years. That's going to continue to be the case. And a lot of teams in this conference are probably underrated just because offense is what carries the headlines, but defense wins championships, as they say. And that's certainly true here in the Big 12.
Well, that's interesting because in talking to Utah, we'll talk more about them here later in the show, but would just be curious to get your thoughts on the bottom of the conference first of all. But with Utah, they want to come in and have that defensive identity. They've with some of the additions that they've made, the clear point of emphasis for them was height and length and being effective on the defensive end. So I think just with that, it seems like Utah has prepared for that defensive pick in terms of the intensity. We'll see, obviously, how it translates this season, but it certainly seems Utah has prepared for that. So, obviously with Utah, they were picked 16th in the conference according to the preseason polls. I've felt like Utah has pieces to compete in the league. They have the pieces. They've had some nice additions, but how do you see the bottom of the league, and who do you feel like has the best opportunity, best chance to potentially crack the top half of the league? Because that's where it feels like the cutoff is going to be for the NCAA tournament.
Yeah, off the bat, I do think that 16th in the country in the conference for Utah that's not a good outlook for them at all. I have them 11th. But there's a fairly decent gap between them. I have them 60th in the country. So that's on the outside looking in terms of the bubble, but that's not that far off from if you're above expectation being, in the at-large conversation. But, compared to them, I have like West Virginia 86 in the country, Arizona State 100, and Colorado 107. That's the bottom three there. Yeah. So I have Utah, according to my metrics, I have them, a bit ahead of everyone else. But there definitely is a clear separation between the top half and the teams that are kind of have tournament expectations and the bottom half. So you're looking at these are my national rankings here. Houston 1, Iowa State 5, Kansas 6, Arizona 7, Baylor 10. That's kind of your top tier right there. And then you have Cincinnati 15, Texas Tech 16, BYU 28, Kansas State 39. That's really the top half of the conference, and you want to be kind of in that group and kind of at close to 500 in conference play in order to be in the at-large conversation. And then after that, there's kind of a gap, and then you have TCU at 59, Utah at 60, and the rest of the conference there. So, of that group outside of those top 8 or 9, I mean, TCU, Utah, and Oklahoma State, I would say probably have the best chance of kind of breaking into that group. But there definitely is a little bit of a gap between that top half of the conference and the second half, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. Yeah. Man, again, the more we talk about this league, the more just the depth of talent and good quality teams just shines. It's amazing. Let's talk individuals, to get a better feel for, as you mentioned, maybe the Big 12 doesn't have the biggest star power, but there are some names, some very recognizable names. Hunter Dickinson, LJ Cryer, Caleb Love are probably the most recognizable names in the Big 12 conference this season. Those guys will be counted on to sort of lead the way for their individual teams, but also kind of carry the torch for the Big 12. I'm curious, Evan, who are some other individuals that maybe you can see sort of helping and elevate themselves to sort of that same sort of status?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, we're always going to be attracted to the players who score a lot, who are kind of putting up the big scoring numbers night to night. But those aren't the only players in this conference that are having a huge impact. My number one player in the preseason in the Big 12 in terms of his projected impact is point guard for Iowa State, Tamin Lipsey. He's not necessarily a go-to scorer, but his playmaking is incredible. I have him rated as the top or the second best defender in the entire country going into the year. He's an absolute defensive menace, and I think that's kind of what drives Iowa State. And a team like Houston is similar, just their defensive tenacity. So I think he's underrated and one of the best players nationally, and certainly in contention for being one of the best players in the conference. Another player kind of that ilk that is dramatically raising their team's ceiling without really stealing all the headlines is Cincinnati got Dylan Mitchell from Texas. And I think he's also another one of these players who he's a very well-rounded player. He's not scoring 20 per game, but his impact in all of the different ways is going to raise his team's performance level. I think he's a really good player for Cincy, and part of why I have them inside the top 20 in the preseason. And then if you're kind of looking for a breakout player who could really be like one of the biggest talking points in the country if their team does well, is JT Toppin for Texas Tech. He came over from New Mexico, I think, and he was a top 5 transfer for me according to my metrics in the offseason. I have him top 5 in the Big 12 in the preseason in terms of projected impact. I think he's really good, and if he plays according to the level that that people are hoping for, I think he's going to be a big name come February, March.
Man, just amazing. Just the more the more we talk about it, it's just there are some stars. It's amazing. There's individual talent, and that's before even getting to some of the other more recognizable transfers, right? AJ Storr at Kansas, right? What is he going to do with Hunter Dickinson and that sort of thing? It's just the depth of talent in this league is super impressive. All right, let's switch gears. Let's turn our attention more to Utah individually. Making the move to the Big 12. They've got a non-conference schedule that is pretty manageable, right? Most of these games they're going to be favored in. There are 3 non-conference games against Mississippi State, St. Mary's, and Iowa on a neutral floor. How important is it for Utah to potentially go undefeated, to go 1 loss, 2 loss? How much does this non-conference slate impact their potential this season?
Yeah, I do think it's certainly, when you're jumping conferences like this, I think a lot of teams do want to kind of take it easier on the non-conference side, and that's certainly the approach that Utah's done because of the gauntlet that they're going to face in conference play. And I think that's, for your first year in the conference, that's totally valid. And the thing is, it's just going to get so much harder once you get into January that I think if you lose 1 or 2 of these games that you're supposed to win, and that's your confidence level going into Big 12 play, you could start conference play 0-5 really easily. I haven't looked at the beginning of their schedule, but that's just kind of the reality that you're facing here. Yeah. So you don't want to drop any of these games that you're supposed to win comfortably, because otherwise you want to be going into Big 12 play with momentum on your side in terms of your confidence, because you already know it's just going to be a big mental shift going in conference play. And if you're already, struggling more than you think you should against these weaker opponents, that's going to be a big roadblock to overcome. So I do think them starting out strong is very important.
Yeah, I'll just give you the first 5 conference games. They're on the road at Baylor to start. Then they return home for a tough test against Texas Tech. They go back on the road to Iowa State, return home for Oklahoma State, and then hit the road for TCU. And then they return home for BYU. So I gave you 6. Those are the first 6 games. So it's a doozy. It's quite the intro to the Big 12.
Yeah, you're probably going 0-3 in those first 3 games because they're all top 16 in the preseason. And that's even if you are playing above expectation. That's just what you're looking at. So if they could steal one of those, that's great, obviously. But if you're already going into that with 2 or 3 losses in the non-con against teams that you're supposed to be beating, and then you just automatic 0-3, that's tough.
I'm curious. So obviously, in talking about this Utah basketball team, it's completely overhauled from last season. A lot of departures, guys moving on. Brendan Carlson moving on from the program after his tenure here. Davon Smith entering the portal. A lot of guys hit the portal. Beyond that, Utah's brought in, I believe, 7 total transfers, 2 high school recruits. How much do you feel an overhaul like this, have we seen kind of a shift where you don't need as much experience and continuity, where teams can sort of put these teams together and put together a competitive team in an offseason? Or does experience and continuity, do those things still hold value in college basketball?
Yeah, to answer your question, I did a study earlier this summer, basically looking at, in this modern portal era where you can flip your roster overnight if you want to in any given season, what is the best strategy for these high major teams to be recruiting players in order to have the most success in the tournament, ultimately have the best chance at a Final Four national championship? And basically what I found is, number one, most important priority for any team in the offseason, and this is very obvious, but get more talent. If you're recruiting players, you always want to look for players who are going to raise your talent level. That kind of goes without saying. But outside of that, the second thing is the teams that are getting good talent through keeping their own players are the ones who are having more success compared to expectations for their season. So specifically, teams that the following season have at least half of their minutes being played by returning players. So players who were with the program the previous year come back the next year, and a majority of their rotation is formed from those returning players. That is kind of the mark of delineation for these teams that are outperforming expectations versus not. And so if you compare a team that has, say, most of their minutes coming from returners versus a team that a majority is filled with new pieces, be that freshmen or transfers, and they're similar talent level, but you have one team with the returners and the other team without, typically the team with the returners is doing better. And that's what we've seen. And so in this day and age, the kind of the, you might think that the tendency is like, okay, just go always hit the portal because you can always get more pieces. But the reality is re-recruiting your own good players is really important. And I was actually expecting to see, I do part of my preseason projections for teams is actually predicting what their rotation is going to look like and what percentage of minutes is coming from returning players. And given that Utah had 7 incoming transfers, I was actually expecting this mark to be lower, but my projection is that they're going to have about 36% of their minutes coming from returners, which is actually fairly healthy for a team that lost a lot of players kind of outside of their control, and had to overhaul it that much. I still think, getting key guys back like Gabe Madsen and Lawson Lovering is a really big deal for them. And I think if some of those guys weren't there, they'd be in an even worse spot than they are. So given the circumstances, I think that's pretty decent what they're looking at going into the season.
Well, that's huge. 36%, given all that they lost from last season's team. That's something. You brought them up, Gabe Madsen and Lawson Lovering. These guys are going to be very important to Utah's success. What sort of jump should Utah fans be looking for, or potentially just translation to the Big 12? How is that going to impact their potential production levels this season?
Yeah, I think Gabe Madsen is obviously a very known quantity, and I have him rated as Utah's best player in the preseason. I don't think that's a huge shock. Super well-rounded scorer and playmaker. He's really good three-point shooter, which is definitely going to carry over to the Big 12, you would hope. 95th percentile in terms of his three-point shooting grade, which is great. And solid on the assist front. I think he's a good defender as well. There's not really a lot of holes in his game. But if we're talking about players that you really want to see a jump from, I think Lawson Lovering is the one. I think he should have a breakout season for Utah this year compared to what he's done in the past. He was under 20 minutes per game last year, but in terms of how the advanced metrics view him, I think there's a lot of untapped potential here. He had a really good defensive grade last year, and in terms of how he ranks on the squad this year, it's the highest grade by far on a per possession basis in terms of his defensive value to the team. It's above a pretty far above everyone else in the team. 98th percentile nationally in terms of his defensive projection, which is really good. Wow. He's a good rebounder. He's good at protecting the rim. But I think the thing that really separates him, and here's what you want to see more of this year, is when you look at how Utah performed defensively when he was on the court last year compared to when he was on the bench, the difference is stark. Last year, when he was on the court, Utah, as a defense, allowed 85 points per 100 possession when he was on the court after adjusting for opponent strength. Without him on the court, that rose to 100 points. So a difference of 15 points per 100 possessions, or if you're kind of scaling that to the game level, about 10 points. So if we're saying he plays a whole game versus doesn't play at all, your team's giving up 10 more points when he's not playing. And some of that can be a little bit noisy, but there's enough signal there to suggest that his defensive impact when he's on the floor for this team is really good. And that's part of why he has such a high defensive projection this year. So you're hoping to see more of that this year. And even with the jump to the Big 12, you really want that to kind of come to fruition.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think Craig Smith, he's talked about that. They had a scrimmage earlier this week, and, he made it a point to emphasize his defensive impact and what he's meant to their team. And so I'm glad that you brought that up, and really impressive numbers to be in that 98th percentile in terms of just his defensive projection. And that's really impressive. So yeah, I think that is going to be a big key, not only Gabe, kind of carrying this team and leading this team, I guess, essentially in scoring on the offensive end, but Lawson has to be that guy, that anchor on the defensive end. So Evan, they brought in, as we've talked about, 7 transfers, and a few of these guys are going to be particularly important for Utah this season. I think their top transfer additions were Ezra Sarr, Mike Sharavjamps, and Miro Little. When you're talking about those three, what stands out to you most about that group? And I'll follow up. I'll let you answer that. What stands out about most about that group, and then I'll follow up with a question about Miro.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing to note with these guys is, when you just look at the transfer haul for Utah overall, I have transfer class rankings during the offseason that basically looks at how good is your incoming class, how good is your transfer portal activity at all. And I think I had them ranked top or 59th in the country out of 360 teams in terms of incoming transfer class. That's really good. When you
Yeah.
look at their overall transfer activities, this is looking at the pieces that you brought in minus the pieces you lost to the portal. They're like bottom 10 in the country, but that's mainly because you lost three amazing players in Davon
Yeah.
Smith, Keba Keita, and Raleigh Worcester, all rated higher than any of the guys they brought in, which again, there's only so much you can do to control that. So you're not necessarily expecting for these incoming guys to match the production of those guys who left. That's just, I think, a little bit of an unrealistic expectation there. But I do like those pieces, particularly in Miro Little and Mongolian Mike coming from San Francisco. I have Ezra a little bit below the other two in terms of projected impact, but I think they're all going to be solid pieces for the team for sure.
That's interesting, and I wanted to ask specifically about Miro because he's kind of he's kind of unique in the sense that he was a top priority for Utah in their transfer portal recruiting, coming out of high school and in his class he was one of the top playmakers, one of the top players, one of the top recruits, and yet he goes to Baylor. He's stuck on the bench behind a really good backcourt rotation, just stuck behind some really good players. And so what are, I guess, reasonable expectations for a player like that who didn't get a lot of playing time at a program like Baylor, but is expected to come in and essentially step into a starting role and lead a team like this?
Yeah, I'm really excited about it. I think there's been a general trend in college basketball recently with transfers where if you have a highly regarded freshman coming out of high school who is underwhelming in their freshman or freshman sophomore year at a school and then transfers to a place that's going to play them more, a lot of times these guys have a somewhat significant jump in terms of production and value that they're bringing to their team just because of that unrealized potential that they didn't really see at their previous school. And so you're certainly hoping for that from Amir Little. That's, even though he didn't do a ton at Baylor, I still have him ranked fourth on Utah's squad in terms of expected production, just because I think there's a lot of unrealized potential there. He showed flashes at Baylor. He's a good playmaker, and just in general, in terms of how Baylor performed when he was on the floor, good things happened. I do think a similar story for him and for Mongolian Mike is that you want them to both improve as scorers. I think they both have shown a lot in terms of setting things up for other players, but their scoring is kind of lacking compared to what they're capable of. And so I think for Miro especially, you're hoping that you're going to see another side of him as a more of a scorer this year than what he was able to show at Baylor in the past.
I'm curious, like how do you go about putting together a projection on a player like that who didn't play a lot? Just I'm curious because you've probably come across that situation quite a bit. Just what have you learned over the years in assessing those types of players?
Yeah, it's basically a lot of it comes down to there is a certain ceiling that is still possible for players who are highly regarded of high school and have only had 1 or 2 years in college and have kind of underwhelmed. And you look at cases like this, especially in the portal the last several years. Harrison Ingram was a highly regarded player, went to Stanford for his freshman year, was kind of underwhelming. But because of how highly regarded he was coming out of high school, my model still predicted that he was going to be one of the most impactful transfers in the country. He goes to North Carolina and was a much, much better player for them. Similar story with a player like Hunter Salas for Gonzaga. He didn't meet expectations his first 2 years there, but again, highly regarded out of high school. There was more potential there based on kind of the hype around him than what was realized. He transfers to Wake Forest and was one of the best players in the ACC last year, is one of the players talked about for being ACC Player of the Year this year. There's lots of examples like this.
Yeah.
Kahlil Ware going from Oregon to Indiana. Again, disappointing first year, transfers, does great his second year. He's in the NBA now. So again, Miro Little's a little step behind those players in terms of but similar story is kind of what you're hoping for there, and that's what's baked into his projection. If we didn't have this high school hype around him, he would be lower. But basically, what my model is picking up on is there's more from this player than what we've seen so far, and he should be taking a step up this year.
And I assume Mongolian Mike is kind of a similar player because he's gone from Dayton to San Francisco, and after his first year, after his freshman year, there was talk of him going into the NBA draft, and that is certainly something that Utah fans picked up on quickly once he announced his commitment to the program. But going to San Francisco and seeing kind of the production there, he hasn't taken that next step. Do you feel Mongolian Mike can be sort of a player along those same lines as somebody that can take another step forward?
I still do think there is that potential there. And I think
Yeah.
hopefully Utah is the right system. Again, similar story to Little. In terms of his grades, based on his skills, I have him as a B plus in playmaking. So he sets the table well for other people in his role. But he's a C minus in scoring volume. That's below average. And he certainly is capable of so much more. That's a lot worse than what people were kind of hoping for from him. And so I think you're hoping that dramatically improves this year. He's an above average shooter from beyond the arc, and you're hoping that he can kind of continue that and improve in that regard. So again, him needing to be a better scorer, I think, is really the main thing you're looking from him. And I still think the potential is there for him to do it.
So that's interesting. So like I said, we just had an exhibition game a couple days ago, and how you're painting the picture is exactly how they performed the other night. Miro Little, I think, finished with 9 assists. Mongolian Mike finished with 6 assists, but Little only scored, I believe, 4 points, and Mongolian Mike finished with 6. And so very, very interesting. But what's interesting is they also had one of those secret scrimmages against Nebraska, and I've seen the box score. Mongolian Mike had 18 points on pretty efficient shooting from deep. I can't remember exactly what the numbers were, but there is that potential. Maybe the scrimmage against Nebraska, I don't know, how you what you can take away from that, but there's certainly potential there, and I think scoring is going to be a big key for them. Evan, would just be curious, looking at the Big 12, when you look at Utah's schedule, what are kind of some key moments, some key areas of that schedule, some games, some matchups that Utah has to take care of business, if we can say that. But then where are maybe some opportunities to potentially, steal a game? Because they're going to have to do that if they want to be, in that top half.
Yeah, just looking at their schedule here, after basically those opening 3 games that I mentioned earlier against, Baylor, Texas Tech, Iowa State, those are all really tough. You've got basically, it seems like their schedule comes in chunks of 3 or 4. So your next 3 are Oklahoma State, TCU, BYU. Those are a bit more manageable. Then you're back again against some of the hard teams, Houston, Baylor, Cincinnati. But then Oklahoma State away, Colorado at home, West Virginia away. All of those are the bottom 3 teams in the conference, according to my preseason projections. If you can go 2 or 3 or even get all 3 of those, that's going to be pretty key for you feeling good about heading into the back stretch of the conference. And so I really think building momentum and, doing well in that stretch is probably going to be pretty important for them.
Yeah, no, I'm with you there. I think that's a very key part of that schedule, that 3-game stretch there. And then they've got, Cincinnati, the Kansas State schools coming to Utah a few weeks after that. So that'll be interesting. Evan, man, this has been great. I, again, appreciate you so much for hopping on. We could probably talk ball for quite a bit longer, but I think I've got to go. I've got my wife yelling at me. So I, again, appreciate the time, Evan. Thanks so much for joining us on the Utah Blockcast.
Absolutely, Steve. This was fun.